You open the app, someone just got promoted, someone else is traveling. Another person looks exactly the way you've been trying to look for months. You close the app, and something that wasn't there 30 seconds ago is now sitting quietly in your chest. Not sadness, not anger, something closer to a single, quiet conclusion. Maybe you're not enough. That feeling isn't random. It isn't weakness. And it isn't about the people you are looking at. It's the result of a psychological mechanism that quietly measures your worth against the lives you see around you. And over time, that comparison doesn't just change how you feel. It changes your self-esteem, because social comparison doesn't attack you all at once. It works slowly, repeatedly, each exposure slightly reshaping how you see yourself, until the person you thought you were begins to feel smaller. And the most dangerous part isn't the comparison itself, it's how normal it has become. Every day, without deciding to, you measure yourself against the person who got promoted, against the body on the screen, against the life that looks more complete than yours feels. You didn't choose the comparison. It appeared on its own, and it left something behind. This video is about that mechanism. Not the obvious insecurity you can name, but the quieter kind. The kind that accumulates slowly, reshaping how you see yourself without asking permission. Psychologists have studied this pattern for decades. What they discovered is precise, uncomfortable, and more relevant now than ever, because social comparison was never designed for a world with infinite reference points. And in the next few minutes, you'll understand exactly what it's been doing to your sense of self, and why it feels so difficult to stop. Picture this. You're having a genuinely good day. Nothing spectacular, just good. You finished something you'd been putting off. You felt productive, calm, reasonably okay with yourself, and then, almost without thinking, you open your phone. 2 minutes later, you put it back down, and the good day is gone. Not because anything happened to you, but because of what you saw happening to someone else. This is the experience most people recognize, but rarely examine, because it feels too small to take seriously, too common to question. You didn't lose anything. Nobody rejected you. Nothing in your real life changed. And yet, something inside you adjusted. A quiet recalibration of your own value, triggered entirely by a life you observed for 3 seconds on a screen. Your circumstances stayed the same, but your self-esteem didn't. Leon Festinger first described the mechanism behind this in 1954. He called it social comparison theory. The idea that human beings have a built-in drive to evaluate themselves by measuring against others, not as insecurity, as biology. The brain uses other people as reference points to determine where it stands, whether it's safe, whether it belongs. In the environment this drive evolved for, those comparisons were limited and real. But today, the brain is exposed to thousands of lives it was never designed to process, and that's where the distortion begins. For the mind to answer a constant, silent question, where do I stand? For most of human history, that question had limited data. You compared yourself to people you actually knew, people whose struggles, failures, and ordinary moments were visible alongside their successes. The comparison was grounded in reality. But digital environments replaced reality with selection. You're no longer comparing yourself to whole lives. You're comparing yourself to moments designed to be seen, and the brain doesn't know the difference. Neuroscience shows that when you encounter someone outperforming you in a domain you care about, the brain's threat detection systems activate. Not because you're in danger, but because your sense of value feels uncertain. Psychologists call this upward comparison, and when repeated frequently, it begins to alter how self-worth is constructed. Each exposure makes the gap feel slightly larger. Each moment reinforces a subtle conclusion. They are ahead, and you are behind. Over time, this doesn't just affect mood, it reshapes identity. Because the mind doesn't store comparisons as isolated events. It integrates them into the story it tells about who you are. And the most dangerous part is that the process feels invisible while it's happening. You don't notice your standards shifting. You don't notice your internal baseline lowering. You only notice the outcome, the quiet sense that you're smaller than you used to feel. The problem isn't that you're comparing yourself to people, it's that you're comparing yourself to performances. Performances optimized for attention, not accuracy. And once the brain accepts those performances as reality, it begins adjusting your self-image accordingly, which explains why certain moments, specific situations, suddenly trigger comparison more intensely than others. Think about the last time you opened your phone without thinking. No goal, no intention, just habit. Within seconds, you're watching someone else's morning, early, productive, composed. And something subtle happens. You weren't evaluating your life before. Now you are. Not consciously, automatically. The morning that felt normal 30 seconds ago now feels incomplete. Not because anything changed, but because comparison introduced a new standard. This is how comparison does its most consistent damage, through accumulation, not intensity. A fitness post makes you aware of your body. A promotion announcement makes your progress feel delayed. A photo of someone else's happiness makes your own life feel quieter than it should. Each moment seems insignificant, but the brain doesn't discard them. It integrates them. It updates your internal position. And over time, the answer to the question, "How am I doing?" begins to drift downward, not because your life worsened, but because the reference point moved. What makes this especially difficult to recognize is that the behavior feels like connection. Scrolling feels social, it feels harmless, but underneath that illusion, your brain is constantly measuring, constantly recalibrating, constantly adjusting your sense of where you stand. The longer the exposure continues, the more natural that lower self-perception begins to feel, until it stops feeling like comparison at all and starts feeling like truth. The first shift isn't behavioral, it's perceptual. Before changing what you do, you have to change what you're seeing. The feed is not reality, it's selection. Every image was chosen, every success was filtered, every moment was isolated from the hundreds that didn't make it online. The brain doesn't see the omissions, it only sees the signal, and it builds conclusions from incomplete data. The moment you recognize that you're not observing lives, you're observing fragments, the comparison loses part of its authority, because you stop treating it as evidence. The second shift is internal. Psychologist Kristin Neff's research on self-compassion found that the most stable form of self-esteem doesn't come from outperforming others. Question. Not how am I doing compared to question. Not how am I doing compared to them. But how am I doing compared to who I was? Progress becomes longitudinal instead of social. And when progress is measured against your past instead of someone else's present, it becomes something comparison can't erase. The third shift is environmental, not elimination, protection. Every exposure to comparison feeds the mechanism. Every absence weakens it. Studies consistently show that even modest reductions in social media exposure produce measurable improvements in self-perception. Because when the brain receives fewer external reference points, it returns to its default state, self-definition instead of self-evaluation. The noise decreases, the constant measuring slows. And something most people haven't felt in a long time quietly returns, neutrality toward themselves. Because the goal isn't to win the comparison, it's to stop needing it in order to know who you are. There's something most people never realize about comparison. It rarely announces itself as harm. It arrives quietly, disguised as motivation, disguised as awareness, disguised as the simple act of looking. But over time, it begins to replace something far more important: your ability to see yourself without interference. You're not comparing yourself to people. You're comparing yourself to performances, to fragments, to carefully selected moments that were never meant to represent a whole life. And when the brain treats those fragments as reality, it slowly begins to rewrite the story you tell yourself about who you are. The most dangerous part isn't that comparison makes you feel behind. It's that it convinces you your value is something external to begin with, that it had to be measured, verified, confirmed, when in reality, the moment you stop measuring yourself against something designed to be infinite, you begin to see yourself clearly again. The comparison was never really about them. It was always about a question you've been carrying, quietly, persistently, for longer than you realize. Am I enough? And somewhere along the way, without deciding to, you started handing that question to a feed to answer. The feed doesn't know what you've built. It doesn't know what you've survived. It doesn't know what you're still becoming. It only knows what performs. And your worth, the real kind, has never been something that performs. So the most important thing you can do isn't to find better comparisons, or cleaner feeds, or more inspiring people to follow. It's to take the question back, to decide that the answer was never in the scroll. It was always in you. If this shifted how you see the comparisons you make, tell me in the comments. I'd genuinely like to know what resonated. To continue this understanding, watch the next video here. And to understand human behavior at a deeper level, subscribe. We decode psychology every week.